Thank you so much for coming out tonight and seeing this. My name is David Fear. I'm the senior editor at Rolling Stone. That, of course, is Ethan Hawke, and this is Paul Schrader. Let's begin at the beginning here. I know in the past you've said you'd written a book about Ozu and Bresson and Dreyer and the transcendental style in film, and you'd always said, oh yeah, I love watching these movies, I love writing about these movies, but I'm not going to make these movies. These aren't the movies that I make. And now, many, many years later, we find that you've made this exact kind of movie. What happened? How did you get to that point?
Well, you can only run away from your childhood so long, and then one day you realize you're now running toward it again. And so about 3 years ago, I had a conversation with the director of Ida, Pavel Pavlovsky, and I liked that film a lot. And we're talking about spiritual style in cinema. We're talking about my book. We're talking about the lowered cost of making films, and that a film that may have been financially irresponsible 10 years ago is now responsible. And that was down at Tau, and I had walked uptown to Chelsea. And in that 8 blocks, I decided I said, you're going to be 70 next year. It's time now to write that movie you swore you would never write. And once I made that decision, then the other pieces started to fall in. But it was a kind of hurdle to actually say, I'm going to go to that place. I'm going to go out on that thin Bressonian ice, and I'm going to take a chance that I'm going to fall in.
And the idea of doing this with a priest and an activist and someone who was going through a real existential crisis that happened within those 8 blocks, the pieces fell in pretty quickly?
Well, so I started thinking about all the films of this ilk that had meant something to me. And, I started piecing them together. And any of you out there who are students of films in the 60s and 70s and 50s will recognize the references on the screen. And so you just take a bit from here, a bit from there, and the secret of sort of stealing, which is also called creativity. And the secret of stealing is you have to steal around. You go back to the same 7-Eleven every time, they're going to catch you. So you go over to the flower shop, and then you go over to the gas station, and then you go to that hot dog stand that nobody goes to. And eventually people think you've made it all up yourself.
But I mean, I'm going to get to Ethan in a second. But when you're bringing this up, it's not a pastiche film either. I mean, if you've seen Diary of a Country Priest, you'll recognize the references, and yet it feels like you're stealing, to use your word, you're stealing in the service of something much bigger.
Yeah, I mean, every film is full of influences, and what I didn't understand about the theft process was how much of it was Taxi Driver. I thought I was just using these European films and Japanese films as references. And then I was in the editing room, and the editor said to me, there's a lot of Taxi Driver in this movie. And I said, yeah, I know there's some, but boy, I didn't realize there was so much. And so I guess that started to become the glue that held these disparate elements together.
Ethan, what was it about this script when you got it and started reading it that struck such a chord within you?
People it's fun to think about references and things like that, but really they're all for naught if they're not in service of something larger, as you said. And what I felt so strongly reading it is it's part of what real writing does. When somebody has voice, that thing that, when Taxi Driver first came out, it was a new voice. There's a voice to the authorship of that movie that is very exciting. It's a voice we hadn't heard before, and I heard that voice very loud and very clear on this page, and it was articulating a way that I was feeling. It's not saying one thing or this thing or this. It's not asking you to vote this way or that way. It's a cry. Yeah. It's a total cry that I felt is that I related to it. It's what good writing does, and it made me as an actor want to play this part. and I felt that very clearly.
How'd you prep for this part?
The joke I like to make is that, when I was born, my great-grandmother felt very strongly. She told my family that I was going to be a priest. I was going to be an Episcopal priest, and it was my great calling. She felt it very clearly, and I spent much of my childhood seeing, like, what is it that made you think that? And she would describe the calling, that in silence I would hear the calling. So I avoided silence at all costs for all my life, and I avoided this calling until Paul Schrader put the collar around me, and I thought, here I am. I have been extremely interested in religion all my life, and so preparing for this part felt like a natural extension of my own self, for lack of a better word, discovery.
Yeah, I mean, there's a number of references to Thomas Merton in the script, and that was one of the things that attracted Ethan to the script, because I was referencing Merton, and his Merton was even much better than mine, and he had spent time at Gethsemane, which is Merton's spiritual retreat in Kentucky, so that rapport already existed.
Merton is such a seeker, and if I could see Toller as a student of Thomas Merton, I felt I had a complete into him. That the trick is liking your character, no matter what's happening, is being their lawyer, being their advocate, loving them, even if their behavior is bad. And so having an into a character where you can really love them.
Let's talk a little bit about the ghosts of art house cinema past that haunt this. And it's mostly that it comes through not just the film that is about something, which is like the films of the 60s that we talk about when we talk about those movies, your Bergmans, your Buñuels, that kind of stuff. They were about things, but the sort of austerity, the starkness of the style of it. Can you talk a little bit about just stripping things away as you were making this?
Well, when you're trying to work on the quiet side, contemplative, durational, spiritual cinema, you get involved in withholding devices. That's cuts across the grain of what movies do best, because movies are built to attack your interest through action. An image creates empathy, and then the image moves through action and empathy. Now, when you're working against those elements, when you're not using much action and when you're not seeking empathy, you're working against the very lifeblood of the art form. And that's why it's such a tricky dance, because now you're starting to withhold things from people that they expect. Withholding a certain pace, withholding music, withholding editing choices, withholding timing. And at that point, the viewer starts to feel uneasy. And they can either get up and leave, which is their right, or they can start to invest themselves and start leaning towards you. And that's the delicate dance of passive-aggressive filmmaking. And I like the term, the scalpel of boredom. And when you use the scalpel of boredom to create a sculpture, you have to be very careful, because if you make a mistake, you're just plain boring.
It's funny. I had a moment. Part of my preparation for meeting Paul and working with Paul was, a life of learning about cinema. And one of my early teachers was Richard Linklater. He gave me your book when we did Before Sunrise. He gave it to me with Bresson's notes on a cinematographer. And I remember when I was about 24 doing that movie and having a scene with Julie Delpy where I was looking at her very passionately and kind of maybe having a emotion, and Rick said, "Cut. What are you doing?" And I said, well, I was really feeling it. He goes, "Yeah, don't do that." and I'm like, I said, why not? He goes, "It's not that it's not good. It's just that when you do that, I can tell you're acting. And if I can tell you're acting, then I also want a plot. And this movie's not going to have any plot. So no matter how well you act, as soon as you start acting, you ruin the whole spell." And it was kind of a preparation for working with you.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's an old, there's an old theater saw which says, if they're crying on stage, they're not crying in the stalls, and that's absolutely true. The trick is not to cry on stage and make them to cry in the audience.
I've seen this film, I think I've seen this film 3 times now, and every single time I get to what I call the cosmic ascension scene, it still just kind of wows me. How we've gone from this very stark movie to suddenly just like taking flight, and damned if this thing works when it shouldn't necessarily. You read this on the page, I imagine you'd just be like, what? And yet, it's kind of perfect. Talk a little bit about both acting in that scene and constructing that scene so that it actually makes the movie hit that next plane.
Well, I knew at the end of this film that we had to jump from the material plane to that parallel plane that runs right alongside us and that we can almost touch it, but rarely do. And so I said, how can I foreshadow that? So the viewer knows that there is another world right next to this one, and we may go there. And so I started thinking of what could I do? And I literally found myself thinking, what would Tarkovsky do? And I said, well, Tarkovsky would have them levitate, because that was his thing. It was his go-to position. And I thought, oh yeah, so yeah, they should levitate. But then I changed the levitation in a bit, because this character played by Ethan is so polluted with despair. He takes this Edenic mystery tour and pollutes it with his own despair.
Okay, one night, you and I are going to go out, we're going to get some scotch, we're going to put some Pepto-Bismol in it, and I'm going to give you a bracelet that says, what would Tarkovsky do? It's just too genius. How did you end up casting Cedric and Amanda in this?
Well, Amanda, the financiers gave me 10 names. And I only went to one before her, which was Michelle Williams. And I thought she was interesting. And the casting person said, well, she's been turning down a lot of work. And then I found out why, which was she was pregnant. And so she read the script, she was captured by it, and she realized that she could squeeze it in just before her cutoff date. And so that was kind of cool, for her and for us, having, a pregnant woman playing a pregnant woman. So when usually in a movie, when a pregnant woman is on screen, they have a big stomach, but then they have a thin little model's face. Well, she has a fat face too, because that's what happens when you put on weight. And so it looks so much better. Cedric, the problem with that character is the enormous predisposition we have toward preachers of large churches. And we have a box for them, and we cram them in there. And no matter who they are, you're going to end up being, Pat Robertson or Franklin Graham or Joel Osteen, or Falwell. And I said, how can I don't want this character to fit into that stereotype box. He's a good guy. He's a CEO, and that has responsibilities, but he's a good person. But I know the audience wants to think he's a bad person. So then I thought, well, how can I cast completely against the grain? How can I cast somebody that people bring expectations of warmth and friendliness to? And so that's, somebody asked me, well, what's this guy like? I said, well, he's sort of like Steve Harvey. And she said, well, you can't get Steve Harvey because he's the hardest working man in show business. And then the next day she said, well, what about Cedric? And sure enough, it worked out. And we've been traveling around with Cedric. And if you're in a hotel or whatever with him, and you're going down a corridor, when people come towards you, you can see it in their faces. They light up, And that's what's rescued that role from being, a villain, a stereotype. Yeah.
You had told them when you hired him, like, I didn't hire you to be funny, right? Is that true?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it was funny. In the first conversation, I said, Cedric, I didn't hire you to be funny. And his answer was, I know that. So he'd already figured it out.
Good. I'm just curious, what's it like for both of you to be putting this movie out right now? I mean, this is a movie that's talking about a sort of spiritual crisis, an environmental crisis, a crisis in business, in politics, in social life. You referred to it as a cry, you know, and it really feels like it's channeling and articulating something that's in the culture right now that's just hopping onto a moment.
Well, that's not a good thing, is it? I mean, you know, anyone who's optimistic hasn't been paying attention.
Have a great Saturday night, everybody. You only have a couple left.
All right, we're going to open up the audience. This to audience questions, but just really quick before we do this, I'm not gonna ask for your opinions on the ending of this movie, but I am curious, just in writing and playing the ambiguity of it, how you manage that tightrope of not having a single interpretation to what's going on.
You talking to me?
Talking to both of you.
I can't tell you what happens at the end because I don't know, because it's built to be interpreted different ways. Some people think that she appears almost miraculously and he is rescued from his death trip and his life is transformed. And there's another way you could think about it, which is he drinks this Drano and now he's on all fours. And as he pukes his stomach out, God, who has not talked to him, finally comes over and taps him on the shoulder and says, Reverend Toller, here's what heaven looks like. It looks just like this. And then he opens the doors, and it looks just like one long kiss. I like that interpretation, too.
So basically, it's win-win.
All right, go ahead, you, sir.
Mr. Schrader, I had read once that you said writing Taxi Driver was like self-therapy, and I was wondering, with the parallels between that movie and this movie, whether that was something that you'd return to, or whether that's something that you feel is a piece of everything that you write.
Well, when you're a young man or a woman, and when you're finding your voice, it can be kind of a painful process, and you're doing it in a painful way. But as you grow older, you learn how to do it without having to go through as much pain. And so, you know, you remember what it was like. A pregnant woman always remembers what it was like to be pregnant. So you sort of remember what it was like to be in that kind of existential pain, even though you're not in it.
First question is more for you, Paul. And your decision on the voiceover, what did that come to you at the time of making the film? Was it there from the beginning? I'm curious.
You know, I've always loved narration. I started, you know, the first film, Taxi Driver, using it. The journal, the narration, use it again in Light Sleeper, use it again here. I think narration is like intravenous feeding, that you put a tube in the audience and you start sending them nourishment, and they can't taste it, they can't feel it, but their body is now filling up with it. And then it has to be done in the right manner. It has to be a drone, it has to be discursive, and it has to be tangential. And you slowly fill the viewer up with a certain sensibility. At the same time, you are showing them a story from only one point of view, a monocular story. And so now you're hearing this guy's voice, you're seeing his world, and time goes on, 45 minutes or more, and you start to identify. You don't have a choice. If you're still in the theater, you're starting to identify. And he's not such a bad person, he's a nice guy. And then he starts to get a little weird. He starts to go off the rails a little bit. And then he goes off the rails a little bit more. And then you're in that weird place where you say, I'm identifying with someone who is no longer worthy of my identification. What does that mean? You know, what is this big crack down the middle of my skull? What is that doing to me? And that's the goal. You know, that's, you know, I don't know what that does to you, but I know when it happens, I've done my job.
Thank you so much for coming out and seeing this. Thank you guys so much for
Thank you
taking
guys
some
for being
questions.
here. It's amazing.